Hello and welcome to episode 116 of the Ego Chall Podcast. My name is Preston Byers, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host Justin Binkowski. And on today's episode, we got another Asim roster change. We got Seany making his long-awaited return to the CDL, and then we obviously had a week full of CDL matches this weekend or this past weekend. Usually we're on Sundays. It is already Wednesday, so things have obviously been a little bit weird, but we're back with this week's episode. But before we get to any of the show, how are you doing, Bink?
Doing all right. Like we were just talking about, Yankees won, Knicks won tonight, so it's a good night. But yeah, a little later in the week than we've been doing it, but we still got some online matches to go over just for the sake of making sure we hit all of them, and we're almost back to land, but we got to get through these first.
Yeah, so it was a pretty straightforward week. We talked about it on last week's episode that there wasn't a single match that was a battle of the top four. So we didn't get that this week. It was a lot of good team versus bad team or just bad team versus bad team and trying to figure out which of these teams are better at the current moment. I think that kind of changes week to week. But we didn't really have a ton of surprises. Really only two matches either of us got wrong. So, but we'll get to that near the end. Let's go through the matches, and then as the roster stuff comes up, then we'll talk about it at that point. So we started on Friday, May 3rd with New York after having an abysmal week last week. They really needed to bounce back, and they definitely did here. They 3-0 the Miami Heretics. I think we both agree that this was not an expected result necessarily because New York played pretty poorly last week, but this was definitely a necessary result for the Subliners moving forward.
That's how I'm pretty sure at least I said it at the end of last week's episode when we were going through it and saw the matchups for New York and their current place in the standings. It was as close to a must-win as you can have at this point if you wanted to make winners bracket for Major 3. So not only do they get a win, but they get an important 3-0 win, which I say important in the sense of, when you're one of those teams with a not as great record and you might have to rely on tiebreakers to squeak into a winners bracket spot. Those map wins and losses count. So 3-0 is definitely the best result New York could have hoped for, especially in response to the struggles last week.
Yeah, I hate the term must win in general because as long as you're not facing elimination, nothing is really must win. Like, of course, momentum plays a factor, and being in a really difficult situation is not ideal, but it's really not a must win. But it felt like we're nearing the point, if they keep losing, that a roster change might be coming down the pipe. And I think this win, and we'll talk about New York's second match in a little bit, but I think this week was just a really big, probably boosting confidence for New York and getting back into the swing of things and getting back in the win column. Next match, we had Optic and Boston, and we both picked Optic to win this series. That was before we were informed that Seany, formerly of the London Ravens, and I think he was on the Red Reserve team, if I'm not, or he was on Reciprocity. I know that.
And Unilad.
And Unilad, which was a very cool team for a little bit. But Seany, one of the better European players over the last 5 years or so, he substituted in for Beans. Seany, I believe, is an assistant coach for Boston, and so he subbed in for Beans, who had a back injury, which is not a typical injury for a professional Call of Duty League player, but it happens. So Beans out, Seany in. It seemed that Optic might lose this series. Despite that, we did not have really I remember Marky B famously subbing in for LAG, and I think they took a map off of the Legion, if I'm not mistaken. But it didn't go, I think, any farther than that. But this series between Optic and the Breach went to Game 5. Optic has to clutch up Game 5 S&D. what do you think about this? Because Optic has obviously been one of the best teams. I think the second best team in the league so far this year. Boston has been on a pretty bad losing streak as of late, has made multiple roster changes, trying to find out some way to get back into the win column, and they nearly do it here. So, what are your takeaways from Optic's too close win against the Breach this week?
I mean, end of the day, they still got the job done. Definitely wasn't a match that I would have expected to go to map 5, even with Boston's full lineup, let alone with Coach Seany filling in. Not even like he's like, I think he was competing in challengers earlier this year, but now like that I don't think
I believe
actively
so.
competing before this. So, um, regardless of the situation, you don't expect a top caliber team like Optic to struggle against Boston in any capacity with their current roster or a coach filling in. Was some weird stuff going on in map 1 where like Kenny was like couldn't play, and like, I think he got up to like 100 points or something for Boston, and then they finally ended the game. They had to restart it. Bit of a ball don't lie though, with Boston being able to come back and take that, but obviously online match flags going on and stuff that could be um a factor in allowing Boston to get a couple wins here. Not going to take any credit away from them for actually, showing some fight in this game. And who knows, maybe it's not a situation where you're going, if from Boston's perspective, right, you're already struggling down at the bottom of the standings for the stage and for the season. And you got a coach coming to fill in for one of your players. Maybe that's just like something you going like, we got nothing to lose. Let's just go out, have fun. That sort of vibe. Maybe that was something that could have, helped them in this situation. But end of the day, Optic still got the job done. Boston, at this point, they do play another match, yeah. But at this point too, they lose 2 S&Ds to go to 0-8 in S&D with the current roster / the roster without Slasher and Asim.
Yeah, and it changes with the second match against LAT this week, but to this point, they had lost 5 consecutive game fives. All 5 of those, or all 4 of the series to this point, with this current roster, I guess, like since the roster change, not including Shawnee, but like the first 4 matches of the qualifiers, they lost 3-2, and dating back to their elimination match at Major 2 against Minnesota, they lost that 3-2 as well. So to lose 5 consecutive game fives, that is obviously horrible. I don't know if there is a solution other than continuing to make a roster change, because really it's been, like you said, S&D has been the biggest issue, but we also know that S&D takes time and takes chemistry, and if you keep making these roster changes, I think you're almost kind of screwing yourself in the end, because you're pretty much just spinning your wheels at that point, so to speak. But we'll get to the Boston second match, and maybe we can talk a little bit more about them, because they've been, in my opinion, one of the most intriguing teams all season long. Another, oh, what were you gonna say?
I just wanted to, mention too, Snoopy did end up dropping 115 kills in this series. For all the people following the narrative of the Boston roster change drama and everything around that, that ties the record for most kills in an MW3 series. So despite outside circumstances, obviously you can't control what's going on with Beans and all that, Snoopy still was able to show up and put up numbers. So it seems to be, at least from the outside looking in, with all these Boston iterations recently, that Snoopy is able to perform in the server. It's the chemistry and potentially some of the other outside stuff that might be getting in the way of past teams' relationships and that sort of deal. But you can't deny at this point the kid's able to slay with the best of them. It's going to be a case of finding the right players to put around him, especially if Boston does believe in building around him. And going from there.
Yeah, it's going to be a really interesting end of the season for Boston and off season for them as well. to see what actually happens with this team. We talked about it before, or I talked about the comparison with Hydra, at least in like the early part of his NYSL career, and how I kind of see some similarities there with Snoopy. And I don't know like what to really make it. I think when a player has skill, they have skill, and like there's really nothing that you can do about that. Like Snoopy is a very highly skilled player. Whether he is, as good as he needs to be like a championship level player, I don't know. Like it, all the time we kind of talk about this, but like it's really about the players around you, because one year Hydra is the worst player, like not the worst player, but like a bad teammate. He's a cancer, blah blah blah. And next year he's literally the world champion and season MVP. That's how things can change if you put the right players around a player like that. And we'll see what happens with Snoopy and what happens with Boston as we progress moving forward into this season. Another team, and we should kind of combine these next two matches. So the last game on Friday was Vegas versus Atlanta. The first match on Saturday was Vegas versus New York. So Vegas, who made a roster change before last week, or 2 weeks ago, I can't remember now, but they started this stage with Purge, and things didn't work out. I forget who they lost to in their last match, but they decided to make a roster change, and they brought in Asim, who had just been released by the Boston Breach. Asim in his first two matches did not perform well. Vegas did not perform well in those matches either. They lost in sweeps both of those matches. Well, this week they play Atlanta, the best team in the world by far, and New York, who is definitely still one of the top four teams, the defending world champions. They lose both of those matches. Vegas does 3-0. So they finish these four matches with Asim 0-12 in map count, obviously 0-4 in series count, and they make a roster change. Vegas does. We don't know officially what who will be replacing Asim, but the report is that it'll be Ojani, who I believe was on the Paris Legion roster the last season that they were the Paris Legion, if I'm not mistaken. But that is the report. I think the rotation reported that Ojani will be making his CDL return with the Vegas Legion to replace Asim, who has been officially released at this point by the Legion. So Asim has been a real big topic of conversation this season because he's now been on multiple CDL teams, and he has not had a very long leash, so to speak, with either of the teams that he's been on with Boston or the Legion. So I want to get your take on this. Is this fair to Asim to get 12 maps with the Legion? I don't know how many in total he got with Boston, but he really just got a stage, the qualifiers, and I think one series at the major. So what's your stance? Is this fair to Asim that he's now been released by the Vegas Legion?
I think before answering it, it's important to point out his statement that he released after he was dropped from the team. Asim said, I was very grateful for the opportunity, got nothing but good things to say about that camp. Unfortunately, sometimes a team doesn't click and it is what it is. Genuinely wish them the best of luck and honestly think it's for the better for both parties. So obviously, things just weren't going as they envisioned or had hoped when they brought him into the camp. I do think it is important to emphasize 3 of these matches that Vegas lost with Asim were to 3 of the top 4 teams in Optic, FaZe, and New York. The other loss to a Seattle team that has played a little bit better recently than some people might have expected after bringing in 0-4 in place of Arcides. But I think that's the one. You look at that one. If you can probably live with losing to Optic, Atlanta, and New York. Sure, you would obviously like to have a couple map wins in there, but those are matches you probably expect to lose most of the time anyways. I think it's the match against Seattle, and obviously that's not the most recent one, but that's the one that's a little more telling to me where, yeah, it just seems like the Legion and Seattle kind of swapped places where they were previously in the season, in the sense of, Vegas was just knocking on the door of the top four. Or, some people said like the gatekeeper of the top four and just holding out on the top spot outside of it. Um, and then Seattle was just performing poorly since the Illy situation. Now they both make a change and they're kind of like, seesawing a little bit and going back. Seattle's seemingly on the rise, and Vegas obviously with an 0-12 map count since the change, their trajectory is going down. So, I think it's just another unfortunate hand that Asim was dealt, and he's gonna have to find another way to get another spot back in the league and show what he's capable of. But at the end of the day, an 0-12 map count, especially this late in the season, is kind of hard to ignore, regardless of who it's against. And I feel like this is a situation previously Paris/Vegas might have just stuck with them. And I kind of like that they're being a little proactive and like, yeah, this just isn't working. If we want to save the season and make champs, we got to be proactive and make a move ASAP. And showing that initiative is something I don't think we may have seen from that franchise in past seasons. So that's the bigger takeaway from me. Yeah, obviously, Asim has a lot of fans and a lot of people won't be happy that he is getting the short end of the stick again. But even him himself saying like he thinks this is going to work out better for both parties, I think that has to be taken into account. And probably a situation where we don't see Asim back in the CDL this year, unless I would be surprised if we did see him back in the CDL just because there's so few matches left. And but he's still, we've sung his praises on this podcast before and what he's capable of doing in terms of affecting the game even outside of the stat sheet and just slaying numbers. So I believe in him as a player and think he'll be back in the CDL sooner rather than later, but probably the last we'll see of him from during the MW3 season, if I had to guess.
Yeah, it's weird because I don't know. We really a lot of these performances from team to team really, it's all based on internal stuff because like we can talk about like, oh man, there's a lot of potential there's a lot of talent, but ultimately it's really how you gel. It goes back to what we were saying about Snoopy in Boston. Like just because he's a really good player doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to translate to wins necessarily. And that's kind of the same thing with Asim. Obviously, Asim's not the same type of player. Like he's kind of on the opposite end of like he's not the super flashy player that Snoopy is. Like Snoopy's going to drop big numbers, which is like kind of jaw dropping in a way. Asim is almost never going to do that. And that also makes it a little bit harder to kind of like decide what his value is to a team, which is, I think, part of the problem. I think that's why he's been, I think, on half of the CDL teams now, is because he is kind of seen as expendable when things aren't going right. He's kind of like the fall guy in this scenario. But I also think like he probably has to take some responsibility, and it does seem like he is. That it was a mutual thing. It wasn't just like they dropped me because, I'm great and they just don't like me or whatever. It's like, no, like it didn't work out. They were only together for 3 weeks, which is, kind of stunning that, a team like the Legion, like you mentioned, who were very hesitant to even make a single roster change at some points in the CDL, especially when they were the Paris Legion. They're now making multiple roster changes within a month. So that seems kind of weird. But I thought that the Purge thing was, it felt reactionary to, they lost 3-2 to, not Vegas, to LAT. And they made a roster change after that. Granted, that was a bad loss. It shouldn't have happened. But it also felt like just kind of like making a change to make a change. And maybe they thought, okay, Asim's available, so we had to strike now before another team goes and tries to get him. Obviously, that was the wrong move. I don't, not necessarily that they could be 0-4, very realistically be 0-4 with Purge, but you kind of ruined some of that continuity and that chemistry that you had been building for most of this season with Purge to try this Asim thing that obviously crashed and burned. And I also think it's kind of reactionary to say, well, we haven't won a map. It's like, well, look at the teams that you're playing. Like, you are literally playing 3 of the 4 best teams. And yes, losing 3-0 to Seattle is not great. It's embarrassing in a way. But like you just said with Optic, like Optic won 3-2 against a team that had no business being that close to beating them. Like Optic is so far and away better than Boston with their full roster that it shouldn't have gone to Game 5 with Seany in place of Beans. And to the other extent, it's it's Seattle beating Vegas and Vegas being like, oh, we got to make a roster change now because we've lost these 4 matches. I don't necessarily think either of these roster changes are doing any good. Granted, Ojani could be really, really good. I don't think we really saw that much of him when he was in the CDL the first time. So who knows? But I also, kind of to wrap up my point, I'm not sure how many more chances Asim gets in the CDL. And that's not necessarily on like him, like it may be, but it's just like think about the teams. Like he's been on half of these CDL teams. Granted, he could always go back to some of them, but I just don't think that he's going to get very many more opportunities. I mean, it goes with like the Gunless thing. Gunless, like before this season, obviously, but Gunless went like 3 or 4 years without being in the CDL after being one of the best players in the world at one point. I think he was the best player in the world, like during IW at a singular point.
Yeah.
So like he was literally the best player in the world, and within like 3 years he was out of the league and wasn't really heard from in the CDL for 4 years. I think there's a real good chance that that happens with Asim, and Asim doesn't have the reputation that Gunless does of being, a former best player in the world, a former MVP. Granted, Asim doesn't have to fill the same role necessarily, but I just don't think that he's going to get very many more opportunities. And I mean, that sucks to an extent, but there's also just so much competition. That being said, if there is expansion, there's a really good chance that he would find his way onto one of those rosters or one of the 16 or 20 rosters if it expanded. But if we stick at 12 teams, there's just really not that much more room that you can keep recycling Asim and think that you're going to get different results. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, I think that's a fair point. I do think he obviously has his connections with certain players and whatnot, and people know what he's capable of. And at the end of the day, as much as people wanna, put these teams together where it's like, I just want to have 4 guys who drop 50 kills every game. One thing we always say on this podcast is there's only X amount of kills on a map. And
it's about egos too. Some guys
and
need to take a back seat.
And you just there's only so much you can do on the map, only so many kills you can get, even if you have literally the 4 best slayers in the game. Somebody's numbers are going to take a hit, and there's always going to be those glue players, at least in my eyes, who can fill in those gaps on certain teams and do what Asim's done, take those long routes, show up in S&D when necessary, and that sort of thing that you might not always expect from top players. And it's also at the end of the day, we got the news about the CDL and the business side of things and all that. Asim is most likely one of the cheaper players who you can, especially for like a mid-season pickup, you probably don't have to pay more than the minimum to get him on a roster. Obviously, it could just be completely uneducated in saying that, but it's as opposed to like trying to sign somebody during the off season where multiple teams are bidding for him. I'm going to use Gwyn as an example. Don't know his contract situation or anything like that, but he's obviously played very well this year to the point where multiple teams might be interested in getting him. Versus Asim coming off of being on 2 teams, short stints with them, and relatively unsuccessful stints. probably something that an organization can be like, okay, well, we got to weigh the monetary aspect of this, how much money we're spending, and that sort of thing. So, and I do think expansion, if that enters the league next year in any capacity, then I think this is kind of a, you know, I think it would be inevitable that Asim would get a spot on one of those teams, especially if some orgs are just hopping in for the first time, right? Somebody with his background and history could be valuable to some newer faces in the league and whatnot. But getting ahead of ourselves here, I think end of the day, right now, this is just it's a roster that didn't work out, regardless of who they played against, and all that. It obviously for Asim supporters and Asim himself, it's not an ideal situation, but it's the hand he's had to do this before, as we've mentioned. There's seemingly been infinite number of tweets where it's like one org tweeting at another org, "Oh, you dropped this," after Asim beats them in his debut match against the team he played on the last year. Obviously didn't get the chance to do that with Vegas and Boston here, but um, it's a very real possibility that we see Asim get another chance. But I do think it's worth mentioning what you said, that it might not come right away, depending on some of these other circumstances like expansion and salaries, all that stuff.
And before we get off completely on the ASIM point, I mean, it's kind of ASIM adjacent. Breaking Point tweeted that Las Vegas extensively evaluated multiple players, including Hixie, and the return of Purge. So I want to get your thoughts on that, because Hixie has not been in the CDL since the Toronto Ultra stuff. Not stuff, like that sounds ominous, but like he was with the Toronto Ultra. They won a major, and he was not signed to a CDL team at the start of this season, and has not been signed by a CDL team so far this year. But Vegas apparently looked at him and looked at bringing back Purge, which I think is a very interesting idea.
That would be crazy to me.
But what do you think about Hixie or Purge somehow making it back into the CDL some point this season?
I mean, I feel like you make a mid-stage roster change like you did with Purge, and then team struggles after you drop him. I would be very surprised if he did. Like, it would just be like a huge, like, I feel like it would be just super memeable, right? If it's like, Vegas drops Purge, they go 0-12, and then they bring him back. It's like, well, you could have just kept him this whole time and potentially had the same record, if not one. You win one map more with him in those 4 matches, then you're better than what you did without him. But Hixie's an interesting name, obviously. Talking about guys, it seems like he fits the mold of what we expect Asim to be as a player, in terms of being that glue guy. Not necessarily dropping the highest numbers, but doing the fundamental plays and the necessary plays, trying to get the job done. The big thing with him, obviously, I'm not up to date on challengers and where players are competing from and stuff, but I'm pretty sure Hixie's in Europe, and if he is, he would have to get a visa. And obviously, as we saw with Real earlier this year, that can be a very lengthy process. So I don't imagine that being the answer for Vegas right now. And I definitely don't think Purge returning is very realistic. That would just be wild to me if it actually did happen. Um,
I
so
would
yeah,
just say with Hixie, he has some experience coming in mid-season and helping
yeah,
the team, because he replaced Standy with the Ultra after Major 2 last year, and then they won Major 3. Granted, things didn't necessarily work out. They were kind of up and down, and then they finished on a relatively high note by getting to the Grand Finals of Champs. But I think that plays into kind of like his resume necessarily, is like he's able to come in and make an immediate impact.
sure,
But that's also Toronto, and this is Vegas. There's
yeah,
different standards, there's different players here, so that it could be a different result.
for sure. And so I think, not knowing much about Johnny, and honestly, like, yeah, I really don't even remember too much about his time with the franchise's first go around, but um it just, the one thing that jumped out to me from these matches, since we kind of just breezed through them, is map 1 in Vegas versus New York. Gio goes 43 and 23, and they lose. The next highest kill total in the game, not even on his team, was 26. Hydra had 26 to lead New York. She had 17 kills higher than Hydra, who was second highest in that map. And I feel like Geo's had, maybe that's an extreme example, but I feel like Geo's played pretty well in his time since joining Vegas. And you would think that if you have, we've talked about Nero enough over these last couple of years where it's kind of like he's the type of player who can just go off at any moment. And it's a question of when that's going to happen or not. But you had the consistent play of Attach, plus that superstar or just that high slaying potential from Nero and Geo on any given map. It seems like a player like Asim would be that or even Hixie for that matter, just somebody doing the small work while the other guys are taking care of the kills around the map. It seems like that would be a natural fit, but obviously, as we saw, that's not necessarily what the team needs or just what's going to work for them right now. So I'm interested to see whoever they do end up picking up, how it works out, and it's really it's tough to say where Vegas stands right now because we had been really talking about them as that team in like that fifth, sixth conversation just outside the top four, looking strong, and now this happens. So it's it's downward trajectory, but technically when you go on 12, the good thing about it is you can only go up from there. And their first map win with whoever their new fourth player is going to be it could be a big turning point for them. So we'll have to see what they end up deciding to do.
I'm not sure if you said it or not, but his 43 kills are the most hardpoint kills in a map this season.
I didn't.
So that's a CDL record this so far this year. And we are on record watch with the Legion as well because they have tied the CDL record for most consecutive maps lost.
Ooh.
So they are at 13 consecutive losses. So really, that next hard point of the first series they play this week is going to be a intriguing one to watch because we could be witnessing history, and the Legion are known to do that, unfortunately. So, but yeah, the Legion went 0-2, 0-6 in map count this week as Atlanta and New York rolled to victories. Atlanta also won their second series of the weekend, a 3-1 win over the Carolina Royal Ravens, although Carolina wins SND. A theme of the Ego Chall podcast this season has been just keeping track of what's going on with the Royal Ravens in search. And they beat Atlanta, who is the best team, but also one of the very best S&D teams this year. So Justin Binkowski, how promising of a S&D win is this? Does it mean anything, or is there anything to really take away from that?
I mean, we were just talking about it from, the perspective of New York's win against Miami earlier in the day. When you're in a situation, on the other hand, here, like Carolina going into a match against Atlanta, you don't expect to win that series. You're trying to take any map wins you can, in order to, potentially help any tiebreaker situations for making winners bracket and whatnot. So it was an important map win for them. Obviously, just a 3-1 loss is better than a 3-0 loss. The bigger thing to note was they were up 4-0 in the search, so it was looking really well, going really well for them. But then it ended up going all the way to around 11, so that was somewhat interesting. It could have been they just caught face sleeping a little bit to start the S&D or whatnot. But I mean, both those, the first hard point was pretty close, 250, 227, then around 11 in the search, but then 3-1 in the control and a 70-point win in the game 4 hard point. So I think you take that search win, but it feels like, recurring theme of the Ego Chall podcast. We are always saying like Carolina is either winning all the hard points or the respawns and losing the search, or they're losing the series but somehow winning the search. It feels like a broken record at this point, but that's kind of been the trend. But I still think at the end of the day this was a tough match for them regardless, and just getting one map win could be the difference between them making winner or loser in some of these tiebreakers. So We'll have to see if it actually does play a factor in that down the road here before Major 3. The one thing I did highlight and see on Twitter after this series, I don't know if it's true. If it is true, it's kind of incredible. But at Money Hill Stats on Twitter tweeted that TJ is allegedly 0-17 versus Atlanta in his CDL career. I feel like that's not possible. Thinking about some of the teams that TJ is on, I guess it could be possible, but regardless, that's just kind of wild if it is actually true.
Yeah, I have no reason to doubt it at this point because TJ has been on some lackluster teams. He hasn't been like on a really good team since like Optic, which was pre CDL. So I'm looking at his. So he was on LAT. He was on OGLA.
That's what I was trying to think. That was
so.
probably his best shot. Would have been, I guess, OGLA during the 5v5 era. But I was thinking like his LAT team in Cold War might have been his best shot to beat Atlanta if he hasn't, but that's arguably been Atlanta's best year before this one. So I guess I wouldn't be surprised. No, I can't say that. I would be surprised if this is actually true. But regardless, one way or the other, it is on the timeline, and there is some potential truth to it. We will leave it up to you guys to determine whether it actually is true or not. But it's out there, and if it is true, I'm pretty mind blown.
That's crazy that he's played 17 series against Atlanta too. Like I know this is over multiple years, but just like, not one win is pretty crazy. But we move on. Optic, they played the final match of Saturday. They beat LAG, but it was not a very comfortable win, I would say, for Optic. Both of the hard points, they were only decided by about 50 points total. And then S&D 6-4 win for Optic, and LAG won the high-rise control. So a 3-1 win for Optic over LAG. LAG, obviously one of the worst online teams this season, if not the worst, honestly. And Optic, they had a really weird week. Still 2-0, which is the most important thing for them.
Yep.
But it definitely was not an easy 2-0 week for Optic.
Oh, and I think that's a, LAG obviously had the impressive 2-0 week the week before this, bringing in Flames for Assault, and a lot of people were, I don't know necessarily a lot of people, but in my mind, people may have been thinking like, is this a honeymoon phase? As that kind of is the common theme or phrase in the COD community. And then Optic would be a much more real test for this squad. And I think they honestly did play pretty well in the series, all things considered, for a newer squad going up against a team that's in the top 4, potentially the top 2, most likely in the top 2 in all considerations, but definitely top 4, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
But all these maps were pretty close, and I think that can only be a good sign for LAG going forward. You briefly mentioned like their struggles online and stuff. Like it's very possible that the previous iteration of this roster is getting 3-0 smoked in all 3 maps online.
Yeah.
In the series beforehand. So to see, obviously LAG wants to win these series, especially with their position and trying to get to champs and winners bracket of this major and all that good stuff. But this is definitely a competitive series against a good team, and I think it could be a step in the right direction for this LAG squad.
Yeah, I think if this was a test, I think they passed the test because it was never expected to be a win, but they were competitive. They were pretty much the opposite of Vegas. If Vegas was competitive against some of the better teams, I think Asim sticks, even if they lose all of those matches. Whereas LAG, they were competitive. And I think that there's some potential there. Definitely, there's no potential to be a top 4 team, I think, for any of the bottom 8 teams at this point, unless like New York really collapses or something. But LAG has like a really good chance to solidify themselves as like a even like a fifth place team, which would be incredible for them or any of these bottom 8 teams at
And
this point.
the door is open for that title now, really, after everything going on with Vegas. It seems like Seattle and LAG could be those teams, especially if LAG keeps performing on land. Um, and that's kind of, you think back to the beginning of the season, all the flack that the LAG roster and coaching staff got for this squad, and now they make a roster change after potentially turmoil within the organization, monetarily, and the layoffs last year and all that stuff, and they're able to have a sub and bring in that sub and see some positive results right away after a roster change. Like there's definitely some people or some people's expectations of LAG are being proven wrong based on recent performances and their performances on land so far this season, to be frank.
Well, it's funny that you mentioned Seattle because Seattle kicked off Sunday and they've been looking pretty good. Like they seem like they might be hitting a groove with this new roster. We were hyping them up a little bit last week. We're back to not hyping up Seattle anymore because the Surge, they drop a series to the Miami Heretics, who had not won a match with this new roster to this point. Miami was 0-4 heading in. They win this 3-2. It's a weird series because Seattle, notoriously a good S&D team, Miami not a very good team in really any particular game mode, but Miami's able to win hardpoint, they win control, and then they win S&D. They go 1-3-5, which is always a pretty nice series because you get the back and forth nature of it. But what are you thinking? Because this is the first loss for Seattle of these qualifiers. They're now 3-1, and Miami now getting their first win of the qualifiers.
Yeah, this was one I really like. I was trying to look at it, and I was thinking the same thing as you. There, where like it's hard to really pick something out from the series that stood out, because it's not like usual narratives of one team doing well in the respawn or one team doing well in the search. It was pretty much right down the middle, 1-1 in the hard points, 1-1 in the searches, and then the control obviously he's only played once. But yeah, definitely a match based on Seattle's, well, I mean, both teams' performances before this. To be honest, you're expecting Seattle to take, but just doesn't go their way, and it's interesting. And I really don't know what to think about either team, all things considered. But I guess that's the state of the CDL right now in my mind with the bottom 8 teams. It's kind of like they can kind of beat any of them on any given day, I guess, and we'll have to see what we're able to get out of these squads going forward. Maybe this is something that helps Miami going forward. They've obviously struggled and made some roster changes of their own over the past few months. Is this the catalyst for them getting back to their online Major 1 qualifier first couple week performance? But Seattle, I think this is, all things considered, based on how they were playing and looking before this, it's a tough loss for them. Definitely one they probably were expecting to win. Maybe they, were caught a little off guard or something like that. Not entirely sure, but I am interested to see how they respond, because it's definitely one I was expecting them to win.
Real quick, I made an error. So Seattle is now 3-2, if I'm not mistaken, in these qualifiers because they had lost to Optic earlier, and Miami is now 2-4. They beat Boston to start. I think I was looking at their records before this series, not after. But so Miami now 2-4, Seattle 3-2. So both of these teams have a realistic chance of making it into the winners bracket to start the next major. But consistency, as we've talked about all season, is an issue with most of the CDL teams and these teams in particular. So we're going to have to keep an eye on them to see if they're actually going to be able to pull through. Next match was Toronto versus Minnesota. A sweep here, but I kind of like the Optic series. It's a lot closer than the series might indicate. The hard point wasn't particularly close, but a round 11 win for Toronto in Invasion Search, and a 3-2 control win on High Rise. Many takeaways from this as Toronto kind of, starts to get back on track, and they're looking, pretty good, all things considered.
Yeah, I think that was really the my mindset for this one as well. Um, was another map or another set where 3-0 series might not be super indicative of the individual map scores, but it was potentially a closer series than some people might have expected, especially like you said in the search and the control. But we do see a lot of 3-2 control, so it's tough to put too much weight into that. Regardless, the one thing that caught my attention was Gunless going 13-6 in the map 2. For you know anybody who we were obviously talking about Gunless a little earlier during the Asim segment and whatnot, but um any longtime COD fans or fans of Gunless will be happy to see that performance, especially even though it's in a loss. It's a strong Gunless performance and against a high quality opponent. So maybe they're able to take some things away from this Minnesota and build on it, but it's obviously not looking great for them at this point. Could be another tough road ahead from them, but we'll have to see.
Final matchup of the week. We didn't get a top four banger, but we did get an interesting. I don't even know because LAT is kind of at the top of the bottom eight right now, and Boston would definitely be near or at the bottom of that bottom eight. So Boston versus LAT. It spoiler alert, the Breach lose again. 0-5, or I believe they might be 0-6 now, but they're winless now through their qualifiers, and obviously Seany was still in this match, so to a certain extent there's an asterisk, but he played better than some other players on the team, so I'm not sure if you could actually even put an asterisk. But the more interesting thing about this series is that Boston lost another S&D. They lost round 11 on High Rise Search. Despite Snoopy dropping 13, Ghosty dropped 13 in the same map. But yeah, it's all bad for Boston. The stats really probably don't do it justice how dysfunctional this team has been. Just they're a horrendous team right now, and I'm shocked. But this is also the first match of these qualifiers that they didn't go to a game 5, which is.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's a good thing for them, if it's better to get their heart broken again in another search, but that's an interesting point. Any takeaways from Boston's, I think, 6th consecutive loss, and I don't even know how many searches, 9 searches in a row?
They should be 0-9 in search, but they should only be 0-5 because they have 2 matches in this final week coming up. But I'm pretty sure they're only 0-5, but
Yeah.
regardless, they're winless since the roster change, and I think that might be the only we talked about Asim going 0-12 with Vegas. The only potential positive, I guess, is he can at least take some solace in the fact that his previous squad is struggling just as much as he did on his new squad. I'm sure, like I mentioned earlier, he would have loved to get a chance to play against that new squad, which would have happened this week if he just made it one more week to with Vegas. But yeah, I know I feel like Asim can't be in the same situation as Slasher, like if he kicked back, laughing, eating popcorn, watching Boston lose. But I wouldn't be surprised if that's what Slasher's doing, and especially with all the drama going on around after the roster changes and stuff. I feel like he's got to feel pretty, maybe not good because obviously you don't want to be dropped, but he's definitely got to be, at least getting a chuckle on the inside that things are, he went out in the open, spilled the tea, said what's going on. And it sounds like, at least based on recent results, that some problems within the camp are still there even after these roster changes. So it is tough, like you were mentioning with Seany coming in and having to fill in for these 2 weeks. saw a tweet today from Boston that said like "Welcome back, Beans" or something. And he was walking into the facility with a cane. I really don't know what's going on there because, um, obviously if he's gotta have a cane, I mean that's a pretty serious back injury. But regardless, hopefully he has a speedy recovery. He's able to come back and give Boston their best chance to win because even like you said, Shawnee did have some decent performances in these two series from an individual perspective, but end of the day, he's a coach at this point, not even like, obviously he's not fully removed from competing. Like it's not like JCap just hopped on the sticks and filled in for the first time in a couple of years. He was at least competing earlier this year and whatnot. But yeah, end of the day, Boston isn't necessarily playing great, and they're gonna have to try and uh, scrounge up a couple wins this last week here to hopefully make a run for winners bracket if they want to, but more likely than not, it's looking like they're going to be in losers bracket to start this major coming up. On the flip side, though, I do got to go. LAT they have been looking pretty strong since making their roster change. I think their record is right at 4-1 because they had two matches coming up this week as well. So they're in a pretty good position, especially with the Seattle loss and New York's just current record. They could sneak into like a top 4 seed for the major if they're able to close out this final week with some strong performances. So they've definitely been improving as the season went along and as they've made a couple of roster changes. Still not really like I don't know what it is with LAT, but maybe it's just because it's like that top 4 divide where it's top 4 and then everybody else. It's really tough for me to just envision LAT like hoisting a trophy or anything this year. But you especially the way the league is right now, you take the wins you can get, and they're playing like this. They're able to get a winners bracket spot, get some wins on land that puts them in a good spot to make champs. And at that point, that's really what those bottom 8 teams have to be aspiring for, in my eyes, at least.
Yeah, so it's interesting because 6 teams right now have clinched a winners bracket spot at Major 3. Atlanta, Optic, Toronto, LAT, Seattle, and New York. Those teams, the seeding is not set by any means, but those 6 teams will be in the winners bracket. The final 2 spots are still up for grabs between Carolina, Miami, LAG, Minnesota, Las Vegas, and Boston. Boston would really need a miracle at this point because they would have to force a tiebreaker by winning both of their matches, and they would have to obviously rely on Carolina, Miami, LAG, Minnesota to lose their matches, or at least one of them to force a tiebreaker. So it's kind of a weird scenario for them. But LAT, they're looking good. The thing is interesting though is right now, if things ended as they are now, they would play Seattle in the first round of the winners bracket, which is the best possible matchup probably for them at this point. If somehow they got to like a 2 seed or something, they could play like a team like Carolina or LAG or Miami or whatever. So that's another good matchup. But it would, one of these teams is gonna finish like 4-3, 5-2, and they're gonna play New York the first round, and that's not a fun first round matchup, regardless. So, it's a weird seeding because New York did have that slump last week. But yeah, that's how things stand right now. But yeah, so the pick'em from this season. So we did pretty well this week. There weren't too many surprises. We both got the Seattle versus Miami match wrong. We picked the Surge. And then I picked Boston foolishly over LAT, which was, Boston's worst loss so far because they didn't even get to a game 5. But so I went 7-2, you went 8-1. So you're 104-50 on the season. I'm 101-53 on the year, and Tremor, as usual, is 0-1. So we got a schedule for you now. We have only 2 matches on Friday, and then 3 on Saturday, 3 on Sunday as we conclude the Major 3 qualifiers. Finally, it's been so long. It feels every time that we
Yeah,
do
yeah.
one of these shows. So Friday, May 10th, we have 2 matches, Toronto versus Boston. Considering Boston has not won a match in like a solid month, I'm going to have to go with the Ultra.
I will take Toronto as well.
LAT versus Seattle. I'll go with LAT, but I could definitely see this going either way.
Yep, I'm gonna go with LAT. I mean, really got to base it on that last loss out of Seattle. Obviously, LAT gets a win over Boston. You can question of how much stock you put into that win, but gonna have to go with LAT here.
Saturday, May 11th, Vegas versus Boston.
Banger.
This could be Boston's first win. It could be. I'm not going to pick that. I'm going to say that Vegas is going to win because Boston has found a way to lose literally every single time, even when they should win.
You kind of took what I was going to say, but basically, I'm going with Vegas too, and I'm going with Vegas without even knowing who their fourth player technically is. I think
it could be theory.
Whoa.
It could be theory.
It could, and I think you got a point there. Boston might still find a way to lose. That'd be wild. We would definitely have some fun next episode if that's what happened. But regardless, yeah, I can't pick Boston right now. This is a match I really don't want to pick either team, especially considering, like I said, don't really know who Vegas's fourth is for sure. But yeah, give me Vegas, I guess.
Minnesota versus Carolina. I'm going to go with the Rocker. This is a pretty difficult matchup, I think, for both of these teams. Neither one of them has really shown that they're much stronger than the other. So I'll go with Minnesota. Hopefully the Iceman, he will be able to pull out some magic again.
There you go. I'll take Carolina, make sure we got something different here.
Seattle versus Atlanta. Obviously Atlanta.
Yep.
LAG versus Miami. Ugh. That is a gross match. I'll go with Miami because these are the LAG onliners. So the sheen is worn off. Last week was maybe that was the exception, but I'm gonna go with Miami.
Yeah, give me LAG. I'm all in on the new squad.
Toronto versus New York, a banger. Finally, to have one of the two of the top 4 teams again. I'll go with Toronto because New York has been looking a little vulnerable, but this last week kind of changed my tune a little bit.
Yeah, I'm gonna go with Toronto as well, but obviously you kind of sneakily mentioned the New York versus Toronto showdown at Champs last year. We were talking about Hicksy. Obviously New York, these teams have some history just from last year. But I gotta go with Toronto for this one.
And the HBR Classic to finish out the qualifiers. Optic versus LA Thieves. Optic looked really iffy, I think is probably the right word. But LAT is kind of like, I just feel like they're like a deck of cards. Like, it looks nice on the outside, and then you apply some pressure and it falls. I'm going to go with Optic. Optic is obviously a really good team, even if they don't always play up to their level, but I think they will for this match.
Yeah, I was gonna say that this is probably one, a couple weeks ago, or maybe even just a week ago. You might not put too much stock into thinking LAT's got a shot, but based off of Optics, issues in this past week, despite the 2-0 week, losing some maps to Boston with a sub and online issues with Kenny and whatnot, there is more, of a chance in my eyes that LAT could cause an upset here. But I still got to go with Optic.
And LAT, they have a real chance at getting the 2nd seed if they win both of their matches this week. Obviously, it's a big if, especially playing Optic. But if they win both, they would be 6-1 in these qualifiers, which I would imagine. I mean, technically they could get first. I just don't see Atlanta losing, so Atlanta's probably going to get first, and then there could be a tiebreaker for 2nd at that point with Toronto. But a very interesting qualifier stretch from LAT. This is a big test for them just to see where they are. Not necessarily expecting them to win, but just in general, it's kind of the LAG idea. Let's see what you can do against a really good team if you can put up a good fight. And maybe that'll give us a better indication of what we can expect once we actually get to the major. So just to quickly recap the standings for the qualifiers heading into the final week: Atlanta first place 6-0. Optic is 5-1 in second place. Toronto and LAT tied for third at 4-1. Seattle is in fifth at 3-2. New York is in sixth at 3-3. New York is the last team that has already punched a spot in the winners bracket, like I mentioned earlier. And then there's Carolina, Miami, LAG, and Minnesota. They are all tied for seventh place at the moment at 2-4. So, you know, we're gonna get something. We're gonna see some teams really get their hearts broken and start in the losers bracket. And then we got Vegas at 11th. And they actually have the worst map win percentage. If you can believe a team that has lost 13 maps in a row, they have the worst map win percentage of any team in these qualifiers at 25%. And then obviously the Boston Breach are winless at 0-5, despite having a better map win percentage than Vegas, Minnesota, and LAG. So there's the moral victory for the Boston Breach. But yeah, I think that about does it. We're at just about an hour. We'll be back next week, or we're almost to next week at this point. But we'll be hopefully we'll be back with a live show on Sunday. I believe that's May 12th. Then the podcast will go up like May 13th on Monday. I'm going to a wedding, so I'll be out of town until Sunday. I'll be coming back Sunday. So I'll have to kind of squeeze in some of the matches on Sunday when I get back. But that's the hope right now, is to do the live show on Sunday, and then the podcast, the YouTube video will go up on Monday morning. But if not, we will be back for next week. We will 100% be back. We got a major preview. We got to talk about some of these matches. We got to talk about if LAG are now the front runners to win champs or something like that. If there's anything that pops up, obviously we'll talk about it. And we'll have to be talking about the Vegas Legion and whoever ends up being in the roster at this point. Maybe they'll make another roster change. Maybe Purge will be the new head coach. Anything is possible in the CDL, and especially with the Vegas Legion. But we'll be back in a few days to a week, somewhere in that frame. But make sure to subscribe to the YouTube. Make sure to follow or like the podcast feed wherever you're listening or watching on. Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music. Make sure to give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcast. Make sure to like the YouTube videos and leave a comment. I think a few people left a comment on either the last one or 2 episodes ago, which we always appreciate. If you have any questions for us, obviously, you can always tweet us at jbink with 2 Ks, at Pres Byers, podcast was at Ego Chall Podcast, or you can leave a comment on the YouTube video, and we'll get to it, and we'll answer your questions if there are any. Yeah, I think that about does it. Bink, take it away.
Yep. You guys, as always, for all the support. Really appreciate it. Kind of mentioned it throughout the show, but obviously you got one more week of online matches and we get to the fun stuff. We always love our major previews and recap episodes, so we're getting there. The slog of the online matches is almost done for this time, and then you think about it, we're only got another couple weeks of the online matches after this next major, and then we're done with online matches for a couple months, because then we'll have just the final major and then champs. So season's quickly coming to an end here, but we do have plenty of matches still to go over, and we're obviously going to bring you all our thoughts and whatnot on all of them as the season plays out. So thank you guys as always. Hope you enjoyed this episode, and hope to see you next time we are live, whenever that will be. And as always, remember to send the chow.